In the heart of Wyoming's rugged landscape, where winter winds whisper secrets across snow-covered plains, Sarah Matthews wipes down the counter of the Sunrise Diner for the 1000th time. Her calloused hands tell the story of countless double shifts, all to keep her teenage brother in school after their parents' passing. She barely notices the weathered cowboy at the counter, his coffee growing cold as he watches her with quiet intensity. His worn boots and patched jacket suggest another drifter, but his eyes hold a depth that speaks of something more. When he slips away without paying his bill, leaving only a hastily scribbled note of apology, Sarah's world begins to shift in ways she never imagined. Could this mysterious stranger be more than just another customer who can't afford his coffee? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn painted the Wyoming sky in watercolor hues of pink and gold as Sarah Matthews arrived at the Sunrise Diner for another day's work. The familiar jingle of her keys echoed in the empty parking lot, accompanied by the crunch of fresh snow beneath. Her well-worn boots. February's bitter wind cut through her jacket, but she barely noticed anymore. Winter had become as much a part of her routine as everything else. Inside, she flipped on the lights, watching them flicker to life one by one, illuminating the chrome-trimmed counter and red vinyl booths that had been her second home for the past 3 years. The coffee maker gurgled to life, its aroma filling the space with promises of warmth and comfort. She pulled out Tommy's college applications from her bag, setting them carefully on the counter. A morning ritual that reminded her why she was here, why every double shift mattered. The applications had grown dog-eared over the past weeks as she'd reviewed them during quiet moments between customers. University of Wyoming, Colorado State, Montana State, each one representing a different, possible future for her little brother. Their parents would have been proud of Tommy's determination, of how he'd maintained straight A's, even after the accident that took them both 2 years ago. Sarah's hand instinctively went to the locket at her neck, the only piece of her mother she had left. Inside, a faded photograph showed their family in happier times. Mom, Dad, 14-year-old Sarah, and 11-year-old Tommy, all smiling on their last vacation to Yellowstone. The memories washed over her like a warm tide. Dad's hearty laugh, Mom's gentle touch, the way they'd always made everything seem possible. The bell above the door chimed, startling her from her reverie. Earl Henderson, right on schedule, shuffled in with his newspaper tucked under one arm. The retired rancher had been the diner's first customer every morning for longer than Sarah had worked there. "Morning, sweetheart," he called out, settling into his usual spot at the counter. "Any sign of that cowboy from yesterday?" Sarah's cheeks warmed slightly as she poured Earl's coffee, black, no sugar. "No, and I don't expect to see him again. People who can't pay their bills rarely come back to face the music." Earl's weathered face crinkled with a knowing smile. "Don't be too sure about that. I saw something in his eyes when he was watching you. Reminded me of the way I used to look at my Margaret, God rest her soul." "Earl, you see romance everywhere since you started reading those novels Margaret left behind," Sarah teased. But her mind drifted to the mysterious stranger's intense gaze, the way his calloused fingers had curled around his coffee cup, the depth of sadness in his eyes when he'd realized he couldn't pay. The morning rush began filtering in. Ranchers, truckers, and local office workers, each adding their own rhythm to the diner's familiar symphony. Sarah moved efficiently between tables, refilling cups, taking orders, and making sure everyone felt at home. It was what she did best, creating this small haven of comfort in their harsh corner of Wyoming. During a quiet moment, she found herself studying the handwritten note he'd left behind. "I'm sorry. I'll make this right." The penmanship was surprisingly elegant for a rough-looking ranch hand, each letter carefully formed despite the apparent haste of its writing. Something about those words stirred a feeling she couldn't quite name. Not quite hope, not quite curiosity, but something in between. Tommy burst through the door just as the morning rush was winding down, his backpack slung over one shoulder, cheeks red from the cold. At 17, he was already taller than their father had been, though he shared the same kind eyes and easy smile. "Sarah, you'll never believe what Mrs. Henderson said about my English essay." He pulled out a paper marked with a bright red. A+, his grin wide enough to light up the whole diner. "She says with writing like this, I could get a scholarship." Sarah's heart swelled with pride and something else, a bittersweet ache that came from watching her little brother grow into the man their parents would never see. "That's amazing, Tommy. We'll celebrate tonight. I'll make Dad's famous chocolate chip pancakes for dinner." As Tommy headed off to school, with a quick hug and a borrowed $5 for lunch, Sarah found herself staring at the empty seat where the mysterious cowboy had sat yesterday. Despite herself, she hoped he would keep his promise to make things right, not for the money, but because something in those dark eyes of his had spoken of stories worth hearing, of depths worth exploring. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the diner's worn linoleum floor. Sarah tucked the college applications back into her bag, straightened her apron, and prepared for another day of serving coffee, making change, and keeping a small corner of the world running smoothly. But for the first time in a long while, she felt something shifting in the air, like the first hint of spring after a long winter. A promise of change carried on the Wyoming wind. The next morning brought heavy clouds and the promise of more snow, but Sarah's step faltered when she saw a familiar figure waiting by the diner's entrance. The mysterious cowboy stood with his hat in his hands, breath visible in the pre-dawn air. This time, his presence seemed different, less shadow, more substance. "Ma'am," he said, voice as rough as worn leather, "I believe I owe you an apology and a debt." He held out a $20 bill, crisp and new. "Name's James, James Miller." Sarah studied him in the grey morning light. Without yesterday's haste and worry clouding her vision, she noticed details she'd missed before. The fine crow's feet around his eyes that spoke of smiles rather than hardship, the way he held himself with a quiet dignity despite his weathered appearance. "You could have just left it be," she said, unlocking the door. "Most folks would have." He followed her inside, boots clicking softly against the linoleum. "My father taught me that a man's word is his bond. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "the coffee was worth coming back for." Sarah found herself smiling back as she started the morning prep. "In that case, would you like another cup? On the house this time." "Only if you'll join me," James replied, settling onto the same stool he'd occupied yesterday. "Seems only fair. And get to know the person who showed such kindness to a stranger." Something in his tone made Sarah pause. It had been a long time since anyone had shown interest in her story. Most folks saw the uniform, the coffee pot, the efficient smile, but rarely the woman behind them. As she poured 2 cups of coffee, the morning light began filtering through the windows, casting long shadows across the counter between them. James took his coffee black, she noticed, and held the cup like someone accustomed to savoring small pleasures. "So, Mr. Miller, what brings you to our corner of Wyoming?" Sarah settled across from him, enjoying the rare quiet before the morning rush. "Just James, please." He took a thoughtful sip of coffee. "And I suppose you could say I'm looking for something genuine in a world that often feels anything but." Before Sarah could probe that cryptic response, the bell chimed, and Earl entered, stopping short at the sight of them. His weathered face broke into a knowing grin. Well, looks like I was right about you coming back, son." James stood, extending his hand. "James Miller, sir. And you'd be Earl Henderson. Been watching this place grow since before you were knee-high to a grasshopper." Earl settled into his usual spot, accepting his usual coffee from Sarah. "You've got the look of a man who knows his way around cattle." A shadow of something. Amusement? Concern flickered across James's face. "You could say that. Been working ranches most of my life." Sarah noticed he didn't specify which ranches, But before she could ponder that, Tommy burst through the door, bringing a gust of cold air and teenage enthusiasm with him. "Sarah, I finished the last application." He stopped short, taking in the scene, his sister, the mysterious cowboy, and old Earl all gathered around the counter like old friends. "Tommy, this is James Miller," Sarah said, watching her brother's face light up with curiosity. "James, my brother Tommy, the college-bound." "Brother I've heard about," James said, shaking Tommy's hand with genuine warmth. "Your sister's mighty proud of you." Tommy's chest puffed up slightly at that. "Yeah, well, she's the one making it all possible. Double shifts, extra hours. She never complains, but I know it's hard on her." "Tommy," Sarah warned softly, but James's expression had shifted, growing more intent as he looked at her. "Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who never let on how heavy their burden is," he said quietly, and something in his tone made Sarah's heart skip a beat. The morning rush began filtering in then, and Sarah had to turn her attention to other customers, but throughout the busy hours that followed, she was acutely aware of James's presence at the counter. He nursed his coffee, exchanged pleasantries with the regulars, and watched her work with those observant eyes that seemed to see more than she was ready to reveal. When he finally stood to leave, he left another 20 under his coffee cup, far too much for a simple breakfast. "For yesterday and today," he said when she tried to protest, "and I'd like to come back tomorrow if that's all right." Something warm unfurled in Sarah's chest, like a flower reaching for the sun. "We'll be here," she said softly. "We're always here." The storm hit harder than anyone expected. Sarah watched through the diner's frosted windows as the world disappeared beneath a curtain of white, the wind howling like a wounded animal across the empty parking lot. She'd already sent Mabel, her afternoon waitress, home early. No sense in keeping her when the customers had dwindled to just James at the counter and Earl in his usual booth, both seemingly content to wait out the weather. A stack of bills lay spread before her, carefully hidden behind the counter. Electric, gas, Tommy's upcoming senior class trip, and now the latest tuition deposit deadline. The numbers refused to add up, no matter how many times she shifted them around. Her fingers trembled slightly as she folded the past due notice from the utility company and tucked it into her apron pocket. "Storm's getting worse," James observed quietly, his eyes meeting hers in the reflection of the window. He'd been coming in regularly for 2 weeks now, always during her shifts, always with those watchful eyes that seemed to catch everything. She tried to hide. "Nothing we haven't weathered before," Sarah replied, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. Her ancient Chevy hadn't been starting well in the cold, and the thought of the drive home made her stomach clench. The bell above the door chimed, bringing in a blast of Arctic air, and Tommy, his face red from fighting the wind. "School's closing early," he announced, stamping snow from his boots. "Mrs. Henderson says it's the worst storm since '98. Earl looked up from his newspaper. "That was the year we lost half the Henderson herd. Road to town was closed for 3 days. He folded the paper carefully, revealing the headline about recent ranch sales in the region. "You'd best head home soon, Sarah. This one's got teeth." As if in agreement, the lights flickered ominously. Sarah began her closing routine, trying to hide her growing anxiety. The bills in her pocket seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. "Tommy, help me clean up," she said, tossing him a dish rag. "We need to get home before—" The distinctive sound of her Chevy's starter grinding and failing cut through. The howling wind. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, fighting back tears of frustration. She'd been saving for repairs, but Tommy's college application fees had eaten through her emergency fund. "I'll take a look," James said, already shrugging in too. His heavy coat. Before she could protest, he was out the door, disappearing into the swirling snow. "He seems to care an awful lot about helping," Tommy observed, his tone carefully neutral as he wiped down tables. "Been noticing how he watches you when you're not looking." "Tommy," Sarah warned, but her brother just grinned. "What?" "I'm just saying, it's nice to see someone looking out for you for a change." The door opened again, bringing in James and a blast of snow. He looked like a character from an old western, his coat dusted white, his expression grave. "Starter's shot. You're not getting home in that tonight." Earl stood, pulling on his own coat. "My Margaret would rise from her grave and haunt me if I left you folks stranded. I've got the old ranch truck outside. It'll get through anything." "Earl, you don't have to," Sarah began, but the old rancher waved her off. "Been driving these roads longer than you've been alive, girl. Besides, Tommy here can help me if we get stuck." He winked at James. "Unless you'd rather give them a ride in that fancy—" "The ranch truck sounds perfect." James cut in quickly, something like panic flashing across his face. "But I'll follow behind. Make sure you all get home safe." Sarah wanted to protest. That she didn't need an escort, that she'd been handling things on her own for years, but the genuine concern in James's eyes made the words die in her throat. Instead, she found herself nodding, gathering her things, and following Earl out into the storm. The drive home was tense but uneventful, Earl's truck ploughing steadily through the deepening snow, while James's dark figure followed in what looked like a new pickup, though the swirling snow made it hard to be sure. When they finally reached the small house Sarah and Tommy called home, James insisted on walking them to the door. "Thank you," Sarah said softly, watching Tommy help Earl back to his truck. "For everything." James stood close enough that she could see the snowflakes melting in his dark hair, could catch the scent of coffee and leather that seemed to cling to him. "Sarah," he began, then stopped, something like internal struggle playing across his features. Finally, he simply said, "Take care of yourself, please." She watched from the doorway as both vehicles disappeared into the white-out conditions, trying to ignore the way her heart seemed to speed up and slow down at the same time when James was near. Inside, Tommy was already building a fire in there. Small fireplace, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he said carefully, "sometimes accepting help doesn't mean you're not strong. Sometimes it just means you're human." Sarah touched the bills in her pocket, thinking of James's concerned eyes, of Earl's quiet generosity, of all the kindness she found so hard to accept. "When did you get so wise?" she asked her little brother. "Must be all that college prep reading?" He grinned, then grew serious. "He's different, Sarah. James, I mean. There's something about him." "Yes," Sarah said softly, watching the snow fall outside their window. "There certainly is." The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, just as Sarah was opening the diner. No return address, just her name written in an elegant hand she thought she recognized, but couldn't quite place. Inside was a receipt from Wyoming State University's admissions office, showing Tommy's application fee and first semester's tuition deposit, paid in full. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the amount, $5,000. A sticky note attached simply read, "From a friend of the community." "Everything all right?" James's voice startled her. He stood in the doorway, snow dusting his shoulders, concern etching his features. She quickly tucked the envelope into her pocket. "Fine," she managed, though her voice wavered. "Just fine. Coffee?" He settled into his usual spot, watching her with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see straight through her carefully maintained facade. Over the past few weeks, he'd become as much a part of her morning routine as brewing coffee and counting the register. His presence brought a comfort she wasn't ready to examine too closely. "Tommy's excited about university," he remarked casually, accepting the steaming cup she offered. "Earl mentioned he got accepted to Wyoming State." Sarah busied, herself wiping down the already clean counter. "Yes, but—" She trailed off, the weight of the mysterious envelope heavy in her pocket. "Sometimes dreams cost more than we can manage. Sometimes help comes from unexpected places," James said softly, and something in his tone made her look up sharply. But his expression revealed nothing except gentle understanding. The morning rush began filtering in, and Sarah fell into her familiar rhythm of pouring coffee and taking orders. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted, like earth moving imperceptibly beneath her feet. Later that afternoon, Tommy burst into the diner waving a letter. "Sarah, Sarah, you'll never believe it." His face shone with excitement. "Someone paid my tuition deposit. The university just confirmed it." Sarah felt James's eyes on her from his spot at the counter, but when she glanced his way, he was focused intently on his coffee. "That's wonderful," she managed, pulling Tommy into a tight hug to hide the tears threatening to spill. "But who would—" "Does it matter?" Tommy whispered. "It's like Mom and Dad are watching over us, making sure I get to go to college like they always wanted." Mabel, working the register, sniffed loudly. "It's that community spirit," she declared. "Wyoming folks take care of their own." Sarah noticed James's lips curve slightly at this, but he remained silent, those observant eyes taking in everything while revealing nothing. That evening, after Tommy had left for his study group and the dinner rush had died down, James lingered over his coffee. The diner was quiet, except for the soft clink of dishes as Sarah cleaned up, the gentle whir of the overhead fans, and the distant howl of wind across the prairie. "You don't have to carry everything alone, you know," he said suddenly, his voice low and earnest. "There's no shame in accepting help." Sarah paused in her work, studying his reflection in the darkened window. "Sounds like something Tommy said during the storm." She turned to face him. "But accepting help means admitting you need it. And once you do that, the world doesn't end," James finished gently. "It just changes." Their eyes met in the dim light, and Sarah felt that shift again, that subtle rearrangement of her carefully ordered world. James stood, leaving his usual generous tip, but paused at the door. "Sarah?" His voice was soft but certain. "Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who learn to let others be strong for them, too." After he left, Sarah found another envelope. Beneath his coffee cup, inside was a receipt for her car's repair bill, paid in full at Henderson's garage. Her first instinct was to run after him, to refuse this kindness from a man who claimed to be a simple ranch hand. But Tommy's words echoed in her mind. "Sometimes accepting help doesn't mean you're not strong." She sank into the booth by the window, watching the stars emerge in the clear Wyoming sky. The envelope from the university crinkled in her pocket, and she thought about all the mysterious blessings that had appeared since James Miller walked into her diner, each one arriving just when needed most. Part of her wanted to question it, to probe deeper into the mystery of this quiet cowboy with his gentle eyes and generous heart. But another part, one that had been silent for too long, whispered that perhaps some gifts were meant to be accepted with grace, like rain after a long drought. Outside, the wind carried the promise of spring, and for the first time in years, Sarah Matthews felt something bloom in her heart, something that felt remarkably like hope. Earl's morning newspaper rattled with significance as he spread it across the counter. "Biggest land deal in county history," he announced to the quiet diner. "Miller Ranch Holdings just bought the old Peterson place. Third acquisition this month." Sarah glanced at the headline while refilling Earl's coffee. "Mystery Rancher Expands Empire." Beside her, James seemed to stiffen slightly, his shoulders tense beneath his worn denim jacket. "Must be nice," Mabel chimed in from behind the register. "My Henry says this Miller fellow owns half the state, but nobody ever sees him, like some kind of cattle-raising phantom. Probably some city slicker," Earl mused, though his eyes darted briefly to James. "Playing cowboy with Daddy's money." "Or maybe," James said quietly, "he has his reasons for keeping to himself." His fingers traced the rim of his coffee cup, a gesture Sarah had come to recognize as discomfort. The bell chimed as Tommy rushed in, bringing with him the fresh energy of youth and possibility. "Sarah, Mrs. Henderson says I should apply for the Miller Foundation's scholarship. They're offering full rides to Wyoming State." Sarah watched as James's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. "That's wonderful, Tommy," she said, but her attention was on James's carefully blank expression. "Though it seems this mysterious Mr. Miller is suddenly everywhere." "Not everywhere," James murmured, so softly only Sarah could hear. Their eyes met briefly, and she caught something like regret in his gaze before he looked away. The morning crowd began filtering in, carrying with them snippets of conversation about the wealthy phantom rancher. Sarah moved between tables, pouring coffee and taking orders, but her mind kept returning to James, to the elegant handwriting on the anonymous donations that matched his coffee cup doodles, to the way Earl sometimes seemed to stop himself from saying too much, to all the small mysteries that surrounded this quiet man who'd become such a constant in her life. During a lull, she found herself beside him at the counter. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, noting the faraway look in his eyes. "Just thinking about masks," he said after a moment. "The ones we wear, the ones we hide behind. Sometimes they protect us, but sometimes—" He trailed off, watching Tommy excitedly fill out the scholarship application at a corner table. "Sometimes they keep us from what matters most," Sarah finished softly. James turned to her then, and something in his expression made her heart skip. "Sarah, But before he could continue, a group of ranchers burst in, their voices carrying news of more land purchases, more mysteries surrounding the elusive Miller empire. James's face closed off, the moment shattered. "I should go," he said, standing abruptly. He left his usual generous tip, but this time added something else. A small, worn photo that had fallen from his wallet. Sarah picked it up after he'd gone. It showed a much younger James, dressed in an expensive suit, standing proudly beside an older man in front of a massive ranch house. On the back, in faded ink, "James and Dad, Miller Ranch, 1995. The pieces began falling into place. The mysterious donations, Earl's careful words, the way James tensed whenever his family name appeared in the papers. But instead of clarity, Sarah felt only confusion. Why would a man who owned half the state pretend to be a simple ranch hand? Why choose to spend his mornings in a small diner, drinking coffee and leaving 2 generous tips? Sometimes Earl's voice startled her from her thoughts. A man needs to know he's valued for himself, not his bank account. The old rancher's eyes were kind, but knowing, just like sometimes a woman needs to learn that accepting help doesn't make her any less strong. Sarah tucked the photo into her apron pocket, next to the university receipt and all the other pieces of the puzzle that was James Miller. Outside, spring was slowly claiming the Wyoming landscape, melting away winter's harsh edges. But in her heart, something else was thawing too, something that had been frozen since her parents' death, something that felt remarkably like trust. Spring arrived in Wyoming with the subtle grace of a watercolor painting, winter's stark whites giving way to soft greens and the tender purple of prairie crocuses. Sarah stood outside the diner early one morning, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of promise, the worn lease renewal notice clutched in her hand. Old Joe, who'd owned the Sunrise Diner for 30 years, was finally retiring. The letter outlined the terms for purchasing the place, a dream Sarah had nursed quietly for years, but one that seemed as distant as the mountains on the horizon. "Penny for your thoughts?" James's familiar voice startled her. He stood a few feet away, looking more ranch owner than ranch hand in the early light, though she doubted he realized it. The photo in her apron pocket seemed to burn with unspoken truths. "Just dreams," she said softly, folding the letter away. "Some too big to say out loud. I've always found that dreams spoken aloud have a way of coming true." He moved closer, and Sarah caught the scent of leather and morning air, like Tommy's college acceptance. Inside, the coffee maker gurgled to life, and Sarah could hear Mabel starting the morning prep. The dinner was her anchor, her purpose for so long. Now, with Tommy heading to college and the lease coming due, everything felt uncertain. "Did you always know what you wanted?" she asked James, studying his profile. "Your path in life?" Something like sadness flickered across his features. "My path was chosen for me before I was born. The size of it. Sometimes it feels more like a cage than a blessing." He turned to her, his eyes intense. "But lately I've been thinking about choosing my own way." The morning light caught his face, and for a moment Sarah saw him clearly. Not the wealthy rancher from the photograph, not the humble cowboy he pretended to be, but simply James, a man standing on the edge of his own crossroads. The diners. For sale, she found herself saying. Old Joe's retiring. James's expression softened with understanding. You'd be amazing at running this place, Sarah. You already do, in all but name. Dreams need more than hope to grow, she replied, thinking of the impossible numbers on the purchase agreement. They need courage too, he said quietly. The courage to reach out, to trust, to be honest about who we are and what we want. His hand moved as if to touch hers, then fell away. Sarah, there's something I need to tell you. The door chimed as Tommy burst out waving a letter. Sarah, I got it! The Miller Foundation Scholarship! His joy was infectious, but Sarah didn't miss the way James stepped back, his confession lost in the moment. The morning passed in a blur of congratulations and celebrations. Regular customers insisted on buying Tommy breakfast, and even Mabel got misty-eyed, talking about how proud their parents would be. Through it all, Sarah watched James, noting how he accepted thanks for the foundation's generosity with a quiet discomfort that spoke volumes. During a quiet moment, he approached the counter, his expression serious. Sarah, about what I wanted. To tell you, I know, she said softly, surprising them both, or at least I think I do. She touched the photo in her pocket. The question is, why didn't you tell me? James's face showed a mix of relief and apprehension, because for the first time in my life someone saw me. Not my name, not my bank account, just me. His voice dropped to a whisper, and I couldn't bear to lose that. Before Sarah could respond, old Joe himself walked in, moving slowly with his cane. The elderly owner looked around the diner with misty eyes before settling at the counter. Thinking about my offer, Sarah? He asked kindly. Heaven knows you've put more love into this place than I have these past few years. Sarah felt James. Watching her, felt the weight of dreams and secrets and possibilities. I have been, Joe. I just don't know if sometimes. James interrupted gently. The hardest part of a dream isn't the wanting of it, but the accepting that we deserve it. His eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Maybe it's time we both stopped hiding from what we really want. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the chrome and red vinyl of the diner Sarah loved, highlighting all the worn spots and potential she saw every day. Outside, spring continued its gentle transformation of the landscape, while inside, something just as profound was beginning to bloom. The Wyoming Morning Herald's headline caught everyone's attention. Mystery benefactor's identity revealed. James Miller's secret acts of kindness. Below it, a grainy security camera photo showed a familiar figure, James in his worn jacket, leaving an envelope at the high school's administrative office. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the article aloud to the unusually quiet breakfast crowd. Sources confirm that James Miller, heir to the Miller Ranch empire and one of Wyoming's wealthiest citizens, has been anonymously supporting local students and businesses while living modestly in our community. Well, I'll be damned, Earl muttered from his usual spot, though I can't say I'm entirely surprised. He glanced at James's empty counter seat. The first morning in months he hadn't shown up. Tommy, who'd rushed in with the paper, looked shell-shocked. Sarah, the scholarship, the tuition payment, it was him all along. Sarah touched the photograph in her apron pocket, the one she'd been carrying for weeks now. Yes, she said softly, I think it was. Mabel wiped her eyes with her apron. To think, all those mornings he sat here drinking regular coffee when he could have bought the whole diner with pocket change. That's exactly why he didn't tell us, Sarah found herself saying, understanding flowing through her like a warm current. He wanted to be valued for himself, not his wealth. The bell above the door chimed, and everyone turned, expecting to see James. Instead, a sleek woman in an expensive suit walked in, her heels clicking purposefully on the linoleum. Miss Matthews? She extended a manicured hand. I'm Victoria Kane, Mr. Miller's attorney. May we speak privately? Sarah led her to a quiet booth, aware of every eye in the diner following them. Victoria placed a thick envelope on the table. "Mr. Miller asked me to deliver this," she said, her tone professional but kind. "He also wanted me to express his deep regret for any discomfort his discretion may have caused." Inside the envelope, Sarah found papers for the diner, transfer of ownership, all the financial arrangements completed, requiring only her signature. Her vision blurred. "He can't just—" she started. "He knew you wouldn't accept it as a gift," Victoria interrupted gently. "The terms are fair market value, with very reasonable payment arrangements. He's not giving you the diner, Ms. Matthews. He's giving you the chance you've earned." Sarah thought of all the mornings James had spent here, watching her work, listening. To her dreams, had he been planning this all along? The thought should have angered her, but instead she felt something else. Understanding. "Where is he?" she asked. Victoria's professional mask slipped slightly. "At the ranch. He hasn't taken the publicity well. Mr. Miller values his privacy, and now everyone knows," Sarah finished. She stood, decision made. "Tommy, watch the diner. I need to go somewhere." "Sarah," Tommy called as she reached the door. Tell him thank you, not for the money but for believing in us." The drive to Miller Ranch took 40 minutes, each mile giving Sarah time to sort through her feelings. Betrayal, yes, but also understanding. Hurt, but also gratitude. And something else, something that had been growing since that first morning, when a seemingly penniless cowboy couldn't pay his coffee bill. The ranch house from the old photograph rose before her, grand but somehow lonely against the Wyoming sky. A security guard stopped her at the gate, but Earl must have called ahead because she was waved through immediately. She found James in the stables, dressed in his usual worn denim, brushing a chestnut mare with mechanical strokes. He looked up as she approached, his eyes wary and tired. "I suppose I owe you an explanation," he said quietly. "No," Sarah replied, moving closer. "I think I understand. All those mornings at the diner, you weren't just hiding from your wealth, you were looking for something real." James's hands stilled on the horse's flank. "I bought the Peterson Ranch when I was 25, he said. "The seller took one. Look at my name and doubled the price. People either want something from me or are intimidated by me. But you—" He turned to face her. "You just served me coffee and treated me like anyone else." "Because that's who you are to me," Sarah said. "Not James Miller, the ranch owner, but James who leaves 2 generous tips and watches out for Tommy and listens when I talk about my dreams." "I never meant to deceive you," he said, taking a step toward her. "Every time I tried to tell you the truth, I'd think about how things would change, and I couldn't bear it." Sarah pulled the old photograph from her pocket. "Some things don't have to change," she said softly. "Not the things that matter." The stable's afternoon light painted everything in gold, catching the dust motes dancing between Sarah and James like suspended stars. Behind them, the mare nickered softly, as if sensing the weight of the moment. "I have something to show you," James said finally, his voice rough with emotion. He led Sarah through the barn's wide doors to a small office tucked in the corner. Inside, a corkboard covered one wall, filled with newspaper clippings about the diner, Tommy's academic achievements, and local charity events. "I've been keeping track," he admitted, touching one article about the diner's famous pie contest from last fall. Of all the things that matter, Sarah stepped closer, recognizing faces and moments from the past few months. "You've been watching over us all this time." "My father built this ranch empire," James said, settling into a worn leather chair. "But he never understood that true wealth isn't in land or cattle. It's in community, in connections." He pulled out an old deed from his desk drawer. "When he died last year, I inherited everything. But sitting at your counter, watching you pour coffee and care for everyone who walked through those doors, that's when I started to understand what real value looks like." Sarah touched a photo of Tommy receiving his academic award. "Why didn't you just tell me who you were from the beginning?" Because you treated me like a person, not a portfolio. James stood, moving to stand beside her at the board. That first morning, when I realized I'd left my wallet at home and couldn't pay for coffee, you were kind, but you didn't let me off the hook. You expected me to make it right, not because of who I was, but because it was the right thing to do. And all the anonymous help since then? Sarah asked, thinking of the tuition payments, the car repairs, the subtle support that had appeared just when needed most. I wanted to help, but I didn't want to overwhelm. Small kindnesses, offered. Quietly. He paused, running a hand through his hair. I know now I should have been honest. You deserved that. Sarah turned to face him fully. You know what I keep coming back to? Not the money or the secrets, but all those mornings you sat at my counter, listening to my dreams about owning the diner someday. Was that part of your plan too? No, James said firmly. Those conversations were real. Every word, every coffee, every moment. That was just me, learning to see the world through new eyes. Your eyes. A comfortable silence fell between them, filled with the soft sounds of horses and distant ranch work. Sarah moved to the small window, taking in the view of rolling pastures stretching to the mountains. It's beautiful here, she said finally. It's lonely, James corrected gently. All of this, he gestured to the expanse of his land, means nothing without someone to share it with, someone who sees past it to what's real. Sarah turned back to him, really looking at the man she'd come to know over countless cups of coffee. The wealthy rancher and the humble customer had merged into someone more complete, someone who had chosen to seek authenticity in a world that often valued only appearances. The diner paperwork, she said. Your lawyer, Victoria. I brought them because I'm a coward, James interrupted. I couldn't face you myself after the article, but everything she said was true. It's not a gift, Sarah. It's an investment in someone who has earned it 1,000 times over. And what about us? Sarah asked quietly. Was that an investment? Two. James moved closer, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. That was the greatest risk I've ever taken. Every morning I'd tell myself today was the day I'd come clean. Then you'd smile or laugh or show some kindness to a struggling customer, and I'd be terrified of losing this real thing we were building. So where do we go from here? Sarah asked, voicing the question that hung between them. That depends, James said softly. Can you forgive me for not telling you the whole truth? Can you accept that the man you knew at the counter and the man who owns this ranch are both real parts of who I am? Sarah thought about all the mornings they'd shared, all the quiet conversations and growing understanding. She thought about Tommy's joy at the scholarship, about the diner's possibility becoming reality, about the way James had tried to help without overwhelming. I think, she said carefully, that sometimes the truth isn't just about facts. It's about intentions and hearts and seeing people for who they really are. She touched his hand gently. I saw you, James. Maybe even before you saw yourself. The diner felt different the next morning. Sarah moved through her opening routine mechanically, each familiar task now layered with new meaning. The coffee maker, that had witnessed countless conversations with James, gurgled to life, its sound somehow lonelier in the empty space. She'd left the ranch yesterday without signing the diner paperwork, needing time to process everything. James had understood, pressing a small packet of old photos into her hands before she left. To help you understand, he'd said softly. Now, in the quiet before opening, she spread the photos across the counter where James usually sat. They told a story she hadn't expected. A young James with his father, both in expensive suits, looking uncomfortable at charity galas. Teenage James alone at boarding schools. College graduation with no family in sight. The images spoke of wealth and privilege, but also of profound isolation. Quite a story those tell, isn't it? Earl's voice startled her. She hadn't heard him come in. You knew all along, Sarah said, not quite a question. Earl settled into his usual spot, his weathered face gentle. Known James, since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. watched him try to live up to his daddy's expectations while his heart pulled him another way. He gestured to the photos. That boy's been surrounded by people wanting something from him his whole life. Until he walked in here, the bell chimed. As Tommy arrived earlier than usual, he paused at the sight of the photos, picking up one of young James on horseback. "You know what I remember most," he said thoughtfully. "Not the scholarship or the help with tuition. I remember how he actually listened when I talked about college, like what I had to say mattered." Sarah touched the most recent photo, James, in his usual worn denim, sitting at their counter, caught mid-laugh at something she'd said. The genuine joy in his expression made her heart ache. "He had his reasons," Tommy continued, surprising her with his maturity, "for keeping quiet about who he was. Can't blame a man for wanting to be seen for himself." Mabel bustled in then, taking in the scene with knowing eyes. "Reminds me of my Henry's grandfather," she said, hanging up her coat. "Owned half the mines in Colorado, but spent every morning at the local diner drinking coffee with the miners. Said it kept him honest, reminded him what really mattered." The morning regulars began filtering in, each offering their own perspective on James's revelation. Instead of judgment or scandal, Sarah heard understanding, even respect. These people, who'd known James only as the quiet customer at the counter, seemed to grasp exactly why he'd chosen to hide his identity. Near lunchtime, Victoria Kane returned, carrying a fresh copy of the diner paperwork. "Mr. Miller asked me to tell you. He understands if you need more time," she said, her professional demeanor softening slightly. "But he also wanted you to know that every conversation, every cup of coffee, every moment here was real, the most real thing in his life." Sarah looked around the diner, at the worn booths where James had listened to her dreams, the counter where they'd shared countless conversations, the community that had somehow known the truth about him before she did. "Tell him," she said slowly, "that I'll have an answer for him tomorrow, and that I understand now about needing a place where you can just be yourself." After Victoria left, Sarah found herself holding the photo of James at the counter. The man she'd known, kind, attentive, genuine, wasn't a lie. If anything, he was more real than the wealthy rancher the papers wrote about. He'd chosen her diner as the place to be himself, chosen her company as his refuge from a world of expectations and obligations. "Sometimes," Earl said quietly, watching her expression, "the richest man in the county just needs a place where his coffee costs the same as everyone else's. And sometimes the strongest woman in town needs to learn that accepting help doesn't make her any less independent." Sarah tucked the photos away carefully, her heart lighter than it had been since the newspaper article appeared. Tomorrow she would give James her answer about the diner, but more importantly, she would let him know that she saw him, truly saw him, for exactly who he was. The morning sun had barely crested the mountains when Sarah pulled up to Miller Ranch. She'd left Mabel in charge of the diner, the signed paperwork tucked safely in her bag. But this visit wasn't about business. It was about understanding. James was in the garden when she arrived. Not the manicured estate grounds she'd expected, but a humble vegetable patch behind the kitchen. His hands were dirty, his expression peaceful as he tended to young tomato plants. "My mother started this garden," he said, without turning around, somehow knowing it was her. The cook would tell her it wasn't proper for the lady of the house to dig in the dirt, but she said the best things in life grow from honest soil. Sarah moved closer, taking in the unexpected sight of one of Wyoming's wealthiest men, carefully staking tender plants. "Is that why you came to the diner that first day? Looking for something honest?" James sat back on his heels, finally meeting her eyes. "I came in because it was snowing and I really had forgotten my wallet." His smile was wry. "But I kept coming back because for the first time in my life, I found a place where my name didn't walk in before I did." "Show me," Sarah said suddenly. "Show me your world, the real one, not what the newspapers write about." Something like hope flickered in James's eyes. He stood, brushing dirt from his jeans. "You might be surprised." The next few hours revealed a James she'd never imagined. He showed her the old barn where he'd learned to ride, telling stories about falling off his first pony while his mother tried not to laugh. In his father's study, now his office, he pointed out the worn spot on the desk where he'd done homework. Under stern supervision. Dad believed in the power of the Miller name, he explained, touching a family photo. He wanted me to understand the responsibility that came with it. But Mom, he smiled softly, Mom wanted me to understand people. In the kitchen, the cook, Maria, who'd known James since childhood, insisted on feeding them lunch. She served them at the weathered table by the window, not the formal dining room, sharing stories about a young James sneaking cookies and tracking mud across clean floors. He was always different from his father, Maria said fondly, setting down a plate of her famous apple pie. Mr. Miller Sr. saw the ranch as a business. Little James saw it as a family. After lunch, they walked the property, James pointing out his favorite spots, a creek where he'd fished with the ranch hands' children, a quiet grove where he still went to think. These weren't the carefully curated spaces of a wealthy rancher, but the treasured corners of a man who valued simple pleasures. The newspaper article called me a mystery benefactor, James said, as they reached a hilltop overlooking the valley. But the truth is, helping people quietly, being part of the community without fanfare, that's what Mom taught me really mattered. Dad built the empire, but she showed me how to be human within it. Sarah thought about all the mornings he'd spent at her counter, drinking coffee and listening to everyone's stories. You're very good at it, you know, being human. He turned to her, his expression vulnerable. Am I? I've been terrified that once you knew the whole truth, you'd see me differently, that the James you knew at the diner would disappear behind, the Miller name and all it represents. Sarah reached for his hand, surprising them both. The James I knew at the diner is the same man who plants tomatoes and remembers childhood stories and cares enough to help people without wanting credit. The money doesn't change that. If anything, it proves it. How so? Because you could have bought the diner outright, could have solved all my problems with a signature. But instead you sat at that counter day after day, being a friend, offering support in ways that preserved my dignity. That's not about money. That's about heart. James's fingers tightened around hers. Sarah, about the diner paperwork. She pulled the signed documents from her bag. I'm accepting your offer, not because you're James Miller of Miller Ranch Holdings, but because you're James, who believes in my dreams enough to help make them real. The sunset painted the valley in shades of gold and promise as they walked back to the main house. In the garden, James's mother's tomato plants reached steadily toward the sky, their roots deep in honest soil. You know, James said softly, I think Mom would have loved you. She always said true worth wasn't in what you owned, but in how you helped others grow. Sarah looked at their joined hands, thinking of coffee cups and quiet conversations, of dreams shared and support given, of a man who owned half the state but valued a simple diner's honest welcome above all else. I think, she replied, I would have loved her too. The high school auditorium buzzed with excitement as families filed in for the graduation ceremony. Sarah sat in the front row, her mother's locket open in her palm, wishing their parents could see this moment. Tommy's graduation gown hung perfectly, pressed in the Matthews tradition, their mother's voice echoing in her memory. Pride shows in the details, sweetheart. They're here in spirit, a quiet voice said beside her. James settled into the empty seat, dressed in a subtle but clearly expensive suit that somehow didn't diminish his essential earthiness. Earl told me your father never missed a school event. Sarah closed the locket gently. Not one. He used to say education was the greatest gift you could give a child. She turned to James, emotion thick in her throat. Thank you for helping me keep his word. You did that, James corrected softly. The scholarship just made it easier. Everything Tommy's achieved, he achieved, because his sister never let him forget what he could become. The ceremony began, with pomp and circumstance filling the air. Sarah watched Tommy march in with his classmates, his head held high. From this angle, he looked so much like their father, it made her heart ache. Principal Roberts took the podium, his voice carrying across the packed auditorium. "Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge someone who has made a difference in many of our students' lives. Mr. James Miller, whose foundation has provided scholarships to 15 of our graduating seniors, including this year's validictorian, Thomas Matthews." A murmur went through the crowd as people turned to look at James, who seemed to shrink slightly from the attention. Sarah reached for his hand without thinking, feeling him relax at her touch. Tommy's valedictorian speech was everything a proud sister could hope for. He spoke about perseverance, about community, about the strength found in small-town connections. But it was his closing words that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "Success isn't measured by what we achieve alone," Tommy said, his voice strong and clear. "It's measured by how we lift each other up. My sister taught me that, working double shifts at the Sunrise Diner to keep our family's dreams alive. And this community taught me that, through countless acts of kindness, both large and small. Some of those acts came from unexpected places." His eyes found James in the crowd, reminding us that true generosity isn't about recognition, but about believing in each other's potential. After the ceremony, during the reception in the school gymnasium, Sarah watched Tommy move confidently through the crowd, accepting congratulations and sharing excited college plans with his classmates. James stood slightly apart, observing the scene with quiet satisfaction. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Sarah asked, joining him. "Just thinking about my own graduation," he replied. "All that pomp and ceremony at my private school, but nothing like this warmth, this sense of real community." "Is that why you created the Scholarship Foundation?" James nodded slowly. "Partly, but mostly because I remembered what it felt like. To have every door opened by money rather than merit. I wanted to give opportunities without taking away the pride of earning them." Their conversation was interrupted by Tommy, who approached with an envelope in his hand. "I have something for both of you," he said, suddenly seeming nervous. "I've been working on this for weeks." Inside was a carefully typed proposal for a summer program at the diner. Cooking classes for kids, business workshops for teens, all funded by part of his scholarship money. "I thought," Tommy explained, "about how the diner was always more than just a restaurant. It was where our community came together, where dreams were shared over coffee, where everyone was welcome regardless of their wallet." He looked at James. "Some people taught me that money is best used to help others grow." Sarah hugged her brother tightly, marveling at the man he'd become. When she stepped back, she saw James blinking suspiciously bright eyes. "The diners changing hands next week," Sarah said. "But I think the new owner would be very interested in this proposal." She smiled at James. "Especially since she's keeping the current name and adding a new motto, where everyone's coffee costs the same." The gymnasium lights caught the tears in James's eyes. "Your father was right," he said softly. "Education is the greatest gift, but not just the kind that comes from books. The education of the heart, of community, of understanding what really matters. That's what you've all taught me." Tommy grinned. "Does this mean I get free coffee when I come home from college?" "Nothing's free," Sarah and James said simultaneously, then laughed at their shared response. Around them, the gymnasium buzzed with joy and possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: the diner's ownership transfer, Tommy's college preparations, the evolving relationship between a waitress-turned-owner and a rancher who'd found his true self over countless cups of coffee. But for now, they stood together, three people whose lives had been transformed by simple acts of kindness and the courage to see beyond surface appearances to the truth of the heart. Wyoming summers painted the landscape in shades of gold, the prairie grass swaying beneath an endless blue sky. Sarah stood at the ranch's fence line, watching James move easily among the horses in the morning light. He'd been teaching her about ranch life, just as she'd been teaching him about running a diner. "The key," he called out, leading a chestnut mare toward her, is to be confident but gentle. Horses sense hesitation. His hands demonstrated the proper way to hold the reins, his touch lingering as he guided her fingers into position. Like customers, Sarah mused, remembering her early days of waitressing. They know when you're unsure of yourself. James's laugh was warm. Exactly. Though I'd say horses are easier to please than the breakfast rush crowd, they'd fallen into a comfortable rhythm over the past few weeks. Mornings at the diner, which Sarah now owned free and clear, afternoons at the ranch when she could get away. Tommy was preparing for college, spending his summer split between helping with his proposed youth program at the diner and learning the basics of ranch management from James. "You're a natural," James said, as Sarah confidently led the mare around. The paddock, just like Tommy, must run in the family. Sarah thought about her brother, who'd taken to ranch life with unexpected enthusiasm. "He reminds me more of Dad every day, always eager to learn something new." The sound of an approaching truck interrupted their lesson. Earl Henderson pulled up in his old pickup, a knowing smile on his weathered face. "Well, if it isn't the two most talked about people in 3 counties. "Earl," James greeted warmly, "come to check on your investment." The old rancher had been the first to deposit money in the diner's account after Sarah took ownership, insisting on buying shares in the business. "Just making sure you two aren't letting romance interfere with good business sense," he teased. Sarah felt her cheeks warm, but James just smiled. "Sarah's business sense is sharper than mine ever was. She's already increased the diner's profit margin by 15%. And he's teaching me about land management and investment portfolios," Sarah added. "Turns out running a ranch isn't so different from running a diner. It's all about taking care of people and planning for the future." Earl's eyes twinkled. "Speaking of the future, heard anything from that boy of yours?" "Tommy calls every few days," Sarah said proudly. "He's settling into his summer job at the university's agricultural department. Says he's learning things that could help modernize the ranch operations." "Always thinking ahead, that one," Earl nodded approvingly. "Just like his sister." After Earl left, Sarah and James walked the property together, their shoulders brushing companionably. The ranch sprawled around them, but it no longer felt overwhelming. Instead, it felt like another piece of their shared story, just as the diner had become part of James's world. "I never thought I'd feel comfortable here," Sarah admitted, pausing to watch the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues. "It all seemed so far removed from my life." James turned to her, his expression soft. "And now? Now I understand what you meant about the land teaching you what matters. It's not about the size of the ranch or the price of the diner. It's about building something meaningful, creating spaces where people feel welcome." "You've always understood that better than I have," James said quietly. "I spent years trying to balance my father's legacy with my mother's values. Then I walked into your diner and found someone who'd figured it out naturally, how to make a business feel like a home." Sarah thought about the changes they'd both embraced. The diner now hosted weekly community dinners where ranchers and townspeople shared meals and stories. The ranch had opened its doors to local youth groups, teaching kids about agriculture and responsibility. "We make a good team," she said softly. James's hand found hers, warm and sure. "The best." He paused, then added with a smile, "though I still can't bake a pie to save my life." "Good thing you have other qualities to recommend you," Sarah laughed, squeezing his hand. As the evening settled around them, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that snowy morning when a seemingly penniless cowboy couldn't pay his own coffee bill. Life had a way of surprising you, of taking familiar dreams and expanding them into something richer and deeper than you'd ever imagined. The letter from the developer arrived on a Tuesday morning, just as Sarah was preparing for the breakfast rush. Sleek corporate letterhead proposed turning the block that housed the Sunrise Diner into a modern shopping complex. The offer was generous, far more than the diner was worth, but Sarah's hands trembled as she read it. "Everything all right?" James asked from his usual spot at the counter. Even now that everyone knew his true identity, he maintained his morning ritual, though. His coffee occasionally came with business advice and gentle suggestions for improvements. "Developer wants to buy the whole block," Sarah said, sliding the letter toward him. "Wants to revitalize the downtown area." The air quotes in her voice were sharp with skepticism. James scanned the letter, his expression carefully neutral. "Hamilton Development Group. I know them. They've been buying up small-town properties across the state. You've worked with them. They've tried to partner with Miller Ranch Holdings several times." He set the letter down. "I always declined. Their vision of progress usually involves erasing what makes a place special." The bell chimed as Earl entered, followed by several regular customers. Sarah tucked the letter away, but her mind kept returning to it throughout the morning rush. The diner had been profitable since she'd taken ownership, but this offer was life-changing money. During a quiet moment, James broached the subject again. "You know, Miller Ranch Holdings could—" "No," Sarah cut him off gently but firmly. "Whatever you're about to suggest, no. I need to handle this my way." His expression softened with understanding. "I know, I have resources that could help." "James." She took his hand across the counter. "I love that you want to protect what we have here, but I need to stand on my own feet. The town needs to see that I can make it without the wealthy boyfriend swooping in to save the day." His smile was wry but tender. "Exactly." She squeezed his hand before letting go. "Besides, this isn't just about the diner anymore. It's about all the small businesses on this block. Mary's bookstore, Pete's Hardware, they've been here for generations." The afternoon brought more challenges. Tommy called from college, excited about an internship opportunity that would delay his return home. "It's with an agricultural technology company," he explained. "They're doing amazing work with sustainable farming practices." "But," he hesitated, "it means I can't help with the summer youth program at the diner." Sarah felt torn between pride and disappointment. "Take the internship, Tommy. The program will manage." After hanging up, she found James deep in conversation with Victoria Kane, his attorney at one of the corner booths. They fell silent as she approached, and something in their guilty expressions made her stomach clench. "What are you two plotting?" Victoria had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Mr. Miller asked me to look into some options regarding the Hamilton development situation." "James!" Sarah's voice held a warning. He stood, looking both apologetic and determined. "I know you want to handle this yourself, but this affects the whole community. At least let me share what I know about their tactics, their weaknesses." Sarah wanted to argue, but the pleading in his eyes stopped her. He wasn't trying to take over, she realized. He was trying to be a partner. "All right," she conceded. "Information only, but I make the decisions about the diner." That evening, after closing, they sat in a booth reviewing Hamilton's history in other towns. Victoria had compiled a comprehensive file showing their pattern. Buy key properties, promise revitalization, then replace local businesses with generic retail chains. "They'll come back with a higher offer," James warned. "They'll try to pressure other property owners on the block. They might even spread rumors about the diner's financial stability." Sarah thought about old Joe, who trusted her to carry on the diner's legacy, about Earl and the other investors who'd bought shares, believing in her vision, about Tommy, whose summer program was already changing young lives. "Then we'll be ready," she said firmly. "I'll talk to the other business owners tomorrow. Form a coalition, maybe even reach out to other towns that have faced similar challenges." James watched her with pride and something deeper. "You're remarkable, you know that? I learned from the best," she smiled. "A certain cowboy showed me that true wealth isn't about money. It's about community, about standing up for what matters." He reached across the table, taking her hand. "I was wrong earlier. You don't need me to protect what we have here. You never did." "No," Sarah agreed softly, "but I'm glad to have you standing beside me while I do it myself." Outside, the summer evening painted the sky in shades of possibility. Sarah looked around the diner, at the worn booths that held decades of stories, the counter where love had grown over countless cups of coffee, the community bulletin board now full of photos from Tommy's youth program. This wasn't just a business to be bought and sold. It was the heart of their town, and she would fight to keep it beating. Autumn painted the Wyoming landscape in rich golds and deep reds, matching the new awning Sarah had installed over the diner's entrance. Inside, the morning crowd buzzed with excitement over the front-page story in the local paper. Local businesses unite, downtown heritage district proposed. Your ideas gaining traction, James said proudly, sliding the newspaper across the counter to where Sarah was pouring his coffee. The article detailed the coalition she'd formed with other business owners to protect the historic downtown area. Our idea, she corrected. You may have been just consulting, but those late nights strategizing made all the difference. They'd found a comfortable balance over the past months. James shared his business expertise freely, but stepped back to let Sarah lead the campaign. She'd organized town meetings, researched historic preservation laws, and rallied community support, while he provided quiet guidance and moral support. Mary from the bookstore hurried in, clutching a stack of papers. "Sarah, the petition already has over 2,000 signatures. Even the mayor's wife signed it." "And I've got something better," Earl announced, making his entrance with perfect timing. "Just got off the phone with the State Historic Preservation Office. They're sending someone to evaluate the block for historic district status next week." Sarah felt James's hand squeeze hers beneath the counter. They'd learned to celebrate victories together while maintaining professional boundaries in public, though everyone in town knew they were a couple. "There's something else we should discuss," Mary said, settling into her usual booth. "The community investment proposal." Sarah nodded, pulling out the draft business plan they'd developed. After learning about Hamilton Development's tactics, she'd worked with the other business owners to create an alternative vision for downtown. Instead of corporate takeover, they proposed community ownership shares and coordinated improvements that preserved the area's historic character. "The numbers are solid," James offered, his tone carefully professional. "The return on investment would be slower than Hamilton's proposal, but more sustainable long-term. And more importantly," Sarah added, "it keeps control in local hands. No one can sell out the whole block from under us." The bell chimed as Victoria Kane entered, carrying her signature briefcase. She'd become a regular sight at the diner, helping the coalition navigate legal waters. "The paperwork's ready," she announced. "We can establish the Downtown Heritage Trust whenever you're ready." Sarah caught James hiding a proud smile behind his coffee cup. He'd suggested Victoria's help, but insisted on paying her usual corporate rates, rather than offering it as a favor. He understood that Sarah and the other business owners needed to feel like equal partners, not charity cases. The morning passed in a blur of signatures and celebrations. By lunch, the trust was officially formed, with Sarah and the other business owners serving as founding board members. The diner hummed with energy as locals came to buy community shares, each person eager to own a piece of their town's future. During a quiet moment, James found Sarah in the kitchen, going over supply orders. "Tommy called," he said softly. "His internship project on sustainable agriculture got approved for expansion. He wants to pilot it at the ranch when he comes home for Christmas." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "He's really finding his path, isn't he? Thanks to his sister who showed him that dreams are worth fighting for." James paused, then added, "Speaking of which, I have something for you." He pulled out a small, worn book, his mother's garden journal. "She wrote about more than just plants," he explained. "She wrote about building things that last, about growing community alongside crops. Reminded me of someone else I know." Sarah traced the faded cover gently. It was more than just a journal. It was James, sharing his mother's legacy, trusting her with his family's deeper heritage. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, "about Tommy's ideas for connecting the ranch and the diner. Not just the sustainable agriculture program, but real partnerships. Farm-to-table initiatives, educational programs, community events that bridge the town and country divide. James's eyes lit up, like the garden teaching the diner, and the diner teaching the garden. Exactly, Sarah smiled. Two different worlds growing stronger together while staying true to what makes each special. The afternoon sun slanted through the diner's windows, catching the new historic district proposal framed on the wall. Around them, the lunch crowd chatted about community shares and preservation plans, about progress that honored the past while building toward the future. "You've changed this town," James said softly. "You've changed me. We've changed each other," Sarah corrected. "And that's the real victory, isn't it? Learning to grow together while helping everyone around us bloom too." Outside, the autumn wind scattered leaves like promises across the sidewalk, each one carrying the possibility of renewal without loss, of progress without erasure, of love that strengthened rather than diminished the people involved. Snow fell softly outside the Sunrise Diner, just as it had 1 year ago, when a mysterious cowboy couldn't pay his coffee bill. Sarah stood at the window, watching the flakes dance in the early morning light, her mother's locket warm against her skin. "Penny for your thoughts?" James's familiar voice came from behind her. He'd arrived early to help prepare for today's celebration, 1 year since the day they'd met, and Tommy's homecoming from his first semester at college. "Just thinking about how much can change in a year," she replied, turning to face him. The diner gleamed with holiday decorations, the newly restored historic fixtures shining alongside fresh garlands and twinkling lights. "Having any regrets?" he asked softly, drawing her into a gentle embrace. "Only that Mom and Dad aren't here to see it all." She rested her head against his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and coffee. They would have loved what the diner's become, what Tommy's becoming. As if summoned by their conversation, the bell chimed and Tommy burst in, bringing a gust of snow and infectious enthusiasm with him. He'd grown somehow taller in the months away at college, his face leaner, his eyes bright with new knowledge and experiences. "Sarah, James," he hugged them both, then stepped back to take in the diner. "The historic restoration looks amazing, even better than the photos you sent. Wait until you see what your sister's done with the community program," James said proudly. "The youth cooking classes are now part of the school's official curriculum." Tommy grinned. "And wait until you both hear about my sustainable agriculture project. The university's given us full funding for the pilot program at the ranch." They settled into their usual booth, the same one where James had often sat watching Sarah work, falling in love with her strength and grace long before he had the courage to reveal his true identity. Now it was their favorite spot for family meetings and quiet moments together. "The whole town's buzzing about tonight's celebration," Tommy said, accepting a cup of coffee from Mabel, who'd arrived for her shift. "Earl says it's going to be the event of the year." Sarah smiled, remembering the old rancher's persistence in planning this anniversary gathering. The entire community had embraced the idea of celebrating not just her and James's relationship, but the successful preservation of their downtown heritage and the launch of their combined ranch diner initiatives. "Your parents would be so proud," Mabel said softly, patting Sarah's shoulder, "not just of the diner's success, but of how you've helped bring the whole community together." The morning passed in a warm blur of preparations. Regular customers brought holiday dishes to share at the evening celebration. Mary, from the bookstore, arranged displays showcasing the town's history, including the newspaper article about the mysterious wealthy rancher who'd found love over coffee. Even Victoria Gaines stopped by, carrying thick folders of new partnership agreements for the ranch diner educational programs. "Remember the first time I brought you paperwork?" Victoria asked with a knowing smile. "You wouldn't even look at it until you were sure it wasn't charity. And now look at her," James added proudly, "running the most successful business revitalization project in the state." Sarah blushed at their praise. "We did it together, all of us." She looked around at the diner, At the worn booths that held so many stories, at the counter where love had grown over countless cups of coffee, at the community bulletin board now filled with photos of cooking classes and ranch visits. As evening approached, Tommy helped James hang the new sign outside, Sunrise Diner, where community grows. Below it, smaller letters added, in partnership with Miller Ranch, nurturing Wyoming's future. It's perfect, Sarah said, watching the snow dust their shoulders as they worked. Traditional but forward-looking, just like us. The celebration began at sunset. The diner filled with warmth and laughter as townspeople and ranchers mingled, sharing food and stories. Earl gave a speech that had everyone wiping away tears, recounting how he'd watched love bloom over morning coffee between a hard-working waitress and a lonely rancher seeking authenticity. Tommy's presentation about the sustainable agriculture program drew excited questions from both farmers and local business owners. The university's backing had opened new possibilities for bridging rural and urban communities through education and innovation. Later, in a quiet moment, James led Sarah outside to watch the snowfall. 1 year ago, he said softly, I walked into this diner looking for coffee and found my future instead. We both did, Sarah replied, thinking of all the changes that had flowed from that simple morning. Though I still say you owe me for that first cup. James laughed, pulling her close. I plan to spend the rest of my life paying that debt, 1 cup at a time. Above them, the diner's lights glowed warm against the winter sky, a beacon of welcome, just as it had always been. But now it stood for something more, a symbol of how love could bridge worlds, strengthen communities, and help dreams take root in Wyoming's fertile soil. The morning dawned crystal clear after the previous night's snow, Wyoming's winter sun turning the landscape into a sea of diamonds. Sarah arrived early at the diner, surprised to find a single red rose waiting on the counter, along with a note. In James's familiar handwriting, follow the coffee cups. A trail of vintage coffee cups, the kind the diner had used since its opening, led to various spots throughout the restaurant. In each cup was a small memento, a copy of the receipt from James's first visit, the newspaper article about the mystery benefactor, a photo of them at Tommy's graduation, the historic district proposal that had saved the downtown area. The final cup sat at their usual booth, containing his mother's garden journal and another note. Some love stories grow wild and free, like prairie roses in unexpected places. Meet me at the ranch when you're ready. Sarah's heart fluttered as she traced the journal's worn cover. She knew what today might bring, had seen the quiet planning in Tommy's eyes, the knowing smiles from Earl and Mabel. But somehow, this simple tribute to their journey touched her more deeply than any grand gesture could. At the ranch, she found more roses leading to the garden where she'd first seen James tending his mother's tomato plants. The space had transformed over the year, now featuring both traditional crops and innovative, sustainable farming techniques from Tommy's university program. James stood in the center, dressed in the same worn denim jacket he'd worn the day they met, looking both nervous and completely certain. I had a whole speech planned, he said as she approached, about how you taught me that true wealth isn't in land or bank accounts, but in the connections we build and the communities we serve. James, Sarah began, but he held up a hand gently. Please, let me finish. I was going to tell you how you showed me that love isn't about rescuing someone or solving their problems. It's about standing beside them while they forge their own path. He smiled softly, but then I realized that everything I wanted to say, you already know. You've known since that first morning when you treated me like any other customer who couldn't pay his bill. He reached into his pocket, then stopped in, surprised as Sarah pulled out a small box of her own. I also have something to say, she said, her voice warm with emotion, about a wealthy rancher who was humble enough to sit at my counter day after day, helping me realize my dreams without ever trying to take control of them. About a man who taught me that accepting help doesn't mean giving up independence. It means building something stronger together." They stared at each other for a moment, then burst out laughing. From behind the garden shed, Tommy emerged grinning, followed by Earl, Mabel, Victoria, and what seemed like half the town. "We couldn't decide who would propose first," Tommy admitted. "So we helped both of you plan it for the same day." Earl stepped forward, carrying 2 small boxes. "These were your mother's rings," he said to James. "Both of them. She always said true partnership means both people choosing each other, equal, in all things." Sarah opened her box first, revealing a simple but elegant band that perfectly matched the one in James's box. "I was going to ask you to marry me," she said softly, "but not to become Mrs. Miller of Miller Ranch. I want to be your partner in all things, while still being Sarah Matthews, owner of the Sunrise Diner. And I was going to ask you," James replied, his eyes shining, "to help me build something new. Not Miller Ranch Holdings, but a true partnership between the ranch and the diner, between the land and the community, between your dreams and mine." "Well?" Tommy prompted after a moment of silence. "Is anybody actually going to ask the question?" Sarah and James exchanged glances, then spoke in unison. "Will you marry me?" The garden erupted in cheers and laughter. As James slipped his mother's ring onto Sarah's finger, and she did the same for him, Earl wiped his eyes unashamedly. "Your parents would be so proud," he told Sarah. "And yours too," he added to James. "Your mother especially would have loved seeing her garden become a place where new dreams take root." Later, after the impromptu celebration had moved to the diner, Sarah and James stood in the garden watching the winter sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues. "You know," James said thoughtfully, "most people would think it's strange that a waitress and a rancher would both propose on the same day." "Most people didn't see what we built here," Sarah replied, touching the ring that symbolized not ownership, but partnership. "A love story that's equal parts coffee and cattle, where both people can be strong individually and stronger together." Above them, the first stars appeared in the deepening Wyoming sky, witnesses to a proposal as unique as the couple themselves. A wealthy rancher and a determined waitress who had discovered that the greatest fortune of all was finding someone who saw you, supported you, and loved you exactly as you were. 1 year later, the Sunrise Diner hummed with the familiar morning rhythm. The new sign outside proudly displayed Sarah and James's Sunrise Diner, though locals still called it by its original name. The historic fixtures gleamed in the early light, while the garden-fresh produce from Miller Ranch added splashes of color to the counter display. Sarah moved easily between tables, her mother's locket now accompanied by a simple gold band. Some things hadn't changed. She still worked the morning shift, still knew every regular's order by heart, but now her work had deepened into something richer, a true labor of love that connected the ranch to the town, the past to the future. "Coffee's better than ever," Earl declared from his usual spot, watching James enter with fresh vegetables from the ranch's greenhouse. Tommy's sustainable agriculture program had proved remarkably successful, though I still say it's the company that makes it special. The bell chimed as Tommy himself burst in, home from graduate school for the weekend. At 21, he'd grown into a confident young man, already making a name for himself in agricultural science. "Sarah, James, wait until you hear what the university said about our latest research." Behind him came Victoria Kane, carrying her ever-present briefcase, but looking more relaxed these days. The Ranch Diner partnership had evolved into a model for sustainable community development, attracting attention from other small towns across the state. "The governor's office called," Victoria announced, settling into her regular booth. "They want to use your program as a template for rural revitalization." "A project?" Sarah felt James's arm slip around her waist as they shared a proud smile. Their marriage had proven as unique as their courtship. She kept her independence as the diner's owner while partnering with him on broader community initiatives. The ranch and diner remained separate businesses, but worked together seamlessly, much like their owners. Remember when you couldn't pay your coffee bill? Sarah teased, leaning into his embrace. Best mistake I ever made, James replied, his eyes twinkling, though technically I'm still paying it off. And technically, Tommy added with a grin, I'm still waiting for that free coffee you promised when I started college. The morning passed in comfortable routine, punctuated by moments that highlighted how much had changed. Mary from the bookstore brought in flyers for their joint Ranch Town Cultural Festival. Young participants from Sarah's cooking program confidently served customers under Mabel's watchful eye. The community bulletin board overflowed with notices for educational programs, sustainable farming workshops, and local business initiatives. During a quiet moment, Sarah found James in their usual booth, studying the old photograph of his parents that now hung alongside pictures of her family on the diner's heritage wall. Mum would have loved all this, he said softly. The garden program, the community partnerships, the way everything's grown together without losing what makes it special. Like us, Sarah replied, sliding in beside him. She touched her mother's. Locket, then his hand. Two different worlds finding their own way to bloom. The afternoon sun slanted through windows, now adorned with both the historic district designation and awards for innovative rural enterprise. Outside, tourists and locals alike strolled the preserved downtown streets, the area's character enhanced, rather than erased by thoughtful development. You know what I love most? Tommy asked, joining them during his break from the ranch's research greenhouse. That everyone who comes into the diner or visits the ranch can see what's possible when people believe in each other's dreams. Sarah looked around at the life they'd built, the diner that had grown from a simple restaurant into a community hub, the ranch that had transformed from a business empire into a force for positive change, the family that had expanded to include not just Tommy, but an entire town's worth of connections. Sometimes, she said, echoing words from what seemed like a lifetime ago, the richest gifts come wrapped in everyday packages. Like love over coffee? James suggested, his eyes warm with memory. Exactly, Sarah smiled, squeezing his hand. One cup at a time. Outside, the Wyoming wind carried the promise of spring, while inside, the heart of the community beat steadily on, nourished by good food, warm coffee, and the enduring power of love that saw beyond surface appearances to the truth of what mattered most.